few weeks ago, and I don't actually know how few weeks ago those few weeks ago were, I did the story of the Korean Grand Prix, and how the whole thing fell apart because the whole endeavour was just kind of... well, it was wasted, really. The track was in the middle of nowhere, it took forever to get to the circuit, there wasn't much in the town once you arrived, and the track as a visual experience wasn't exactly inspiring. Fans didn't turn up, money was spent in the wrong places, and the potential to have something there was, well, there. But the whole thing just died out due to the lack of overall interest. And in the Formula 1 games, it's the only track I happily skipped. But around the same time, there was another circuit that came onto the Formula 1 calendar. So while we've looked at the track that was in the land of technology, great food and tacky pop music, why not look at the circuit that was in the country that now has the highest human population count in the world? In the 2000s, Formula 1 began its journey outwards from its European centre. Races started appearing in places that had never hosted races before, such as China and the Middle East. It was all part of Formula 1's attempt at getting a foothold in emerging markets. And with China and India being the two countries that have the highest population numbers on the planet, with both countries having over 1 billion people living within them, to the point where whole cities have had to be built to ease congestion in some places, it made sense for Formula 1 to go there at a business level. 1 billion people. Imagine if you got a tenth of that watching on television somewhere. Ka-ching! But India had been on Bernie's radar as early as the late 1990s. At the time, India only had 2 permanent racing facilities, one being in Chennai, formerly Madras, and the other being in Kovai, and I hope I've got those pronunciations correct. But these tracks weren't exactly Formula 1 standard. With the way things were going, brand new state-of-the-art circuits like the one that had just been constructed in Sepang, Malaysia, and the changes that had been made to the old Österreich ring were what F1 needed. As time went on, it was either going to be Mumbai or Hyderabad that hosted this race, if it was ever going to be held, with the Chief Minister of the Andhra Pradesh state government pushing hard to get it held in his part of the country. But in the end, the governments at a state and central level decided that funds would not be allocated to host a Grand Prix, because there were bigger issues at hand. One of the issues that was also presented was that India might change its rules regarding tobacco advertising, and with tobacco companies being a major part of F1 team's budget in this time period, that might be something that Bernie was looking to avoid, because in Europe, the shift was already beginning. The UK, Germany and France were the big 3 when it came to not showing tobacco logos, and in 2003 the Belgian Grand Prix would not be on the calendar because of a dispute over Belgium's decision to ban tobacco advertising on the cars. It later became a European Union-wide thing in around 2004 or 2005. Now, I don't know a lot about India in this time frame, or, well, any time frame, so when bigger issues get mentioned, you can only assume that it's pollution and poverty, but there might have been other things going on as well, but like I say, I don't really know anything about the country. My apologies. By 2004, the idea was considered dead, and it looked like India would not be getting its race after all. But at the same time, this is when the races in China, Bahrain and later Turkey would start appearing, with Singapore to come in 2008. Formula 1's new expansion into Asia and the Middle East was happening, so there was potential for India to come back if the money was there. In the interim period between 2004 or so and 2010, the Hyderabad government started putting money into tech startups and things like that. India as a whole had experienced a boom between 2003 and 2007, with the GDP growth rate hitting around 8%. Now, I'm no economist, so I don't know how good that is, but any growth is growth. Some places I'm looking at here have called it a miracle, but again, I'm no economist. From looking at little bits and pieces across an internet, after the dot-com crash in 2001, the interest rates in Western nations dropped and investments started coming in from places like India. But there were reforms at a government level as well, apparently. Did I mention I'm not an economist? Poverty did drop in this time period, but a lot of the sources I've looked at have said to take the statistics with a grain of salt, because apparently in this time period when India was booming, there was still around 15% of the population living on less than £50 a month. So it looked like that India was in a better position to host a race, but the market crash in 2008 helped to put some dents in it. But still, that wasn't going to stop governments from having another look, because by the time the market did crash, India had a team registered in the country in Force India, and the country had seen its first driver go into the sport in Narain Karthikeyan. Karthikeyan had been scheduled to drive his Jordan on the streets of Mumbai in 2005, but the roads weren't good enough to do so. In 2007, that's when the interest started peaking up again. 5 locations were selected for a potential venue. 1 somewhere in Bangalore, 1 in a satellite city to Delhi, a street circuit in New Delhi, 1 in Lucknow, the capital of Uttar Pradesh, and a permanent racetrack somewhere near New Delhi. In the June of 2007, the decision was made to have the new circuit built in Gurgaon, I hope I've got that right, which is the satellite city to Delhi just mentioned, and would be built by Herman Tilke. But in the September of 2007, the organisers said that the track would be moved to Greater Noida instead. Now, Greater Noida, but I think it's Noida, it's Indian, not Japanese, is a planned city. A city built with a purpose in mind, or one that has been planned to look in a certain way, rather than be expanded naturally as people move in and populations grow, like cities like Birmingham and London and San Francisco, wherever. In Britain, the term new town is used rather than planned city, and this is places like Stevenage, Milton Keynes, Telford, Redditch and Corby. Brasilia, the capital of Brazil, is also a planned city, as is New Delhi, the capital of India. Greater Noida is about 30 minutes drive from New Delhi and has a population of around 100,000 people, just over 100,000 people. And because it's so close to New Delhi and so accessible from New Delhi, the greater audience range for this Grand Prix could exceed the millions. Let's just say that the track was built in a much more accessible location than the Yeongnam circuit in South Korea, 30 minutes from the country's capital city, and if I'm reading this right, there's about 28 million people in the area, which should mean that if interest is high enough, the place should be rammed. But problems acquiring the land meant that delays were inevitable, and the global financial crisis didn't help either, so they were on borrowed time to get the track onto the calendar for its scheduled 2010 debut. And one thing it did have over the Yeongnam International Circuit is that it was actually fun to drive. Down a few pints and squint and the layout is a bit like Kyalami but going in the opposite direction. The circuit had, well, I'd say has, since it still exists, a lot of medium to high speed corners, with the centrepiece of the track being turns 11, 12 and 13, which are banked and got a lot of praise from drivers who compared it to the turn 8 multi-apex left-hander at Istanbul, which in itself was copied when the Circuit of the Americas was built in Texas in time for the 2012 season. With the grandstand on the outside of that banked corner, it was not just a difficult corner for the drivers, being a long right-hander which their necks aren't necessarily used to, but it showed the viewing public just how well an F1 car can corner. It had a 1 kilometre long straight which allowed the cars to stretch their legs a little bit, and overall they were expected to be hitting around 195 miles an hour and getting somewhere into the 127s. But in qualifying for the inaugural race, Vettel broke the 124 barrier, and then Jaime Alguersuari managed to get his car over 200 miles an hour, greatly exceeding the expectations that Pirelli and the teams had for this new track. The teams also had an input into how the track should be designed to try and help facilitate overtaking and racing without artificially adding stuff in. One of the suggestions that was done at the request of the teams was that there was supposed to be a hairpin at turn 7, but this was made into the corner it is now to keep up the flow and momentum. The track was also widened at turn 3 so that drivers could take different lines to set up a potential overtake or defend a DRS pass on the straight. The entry to turn 4 was also pretty wide, and the final corner was widened so that cars entering the pit lane wouldn't be arse-ended by the car behind as they slowed up. All in all, it was a pretty enjoyable track, something that the drivers liked. So how did it look from an onboard perspective? Well, let's crank up the noise. The first race was held on the 30th of October 2011. While the drivers enjoyed the track while they were on it, the teams were less happy, finding some of the infrastructure to be unfinished, and they found a colony of bats in one of the pit buildings. But Ross Brawn, the boss of Mercedes at that time, praised the circuit, saying that India was a great place to hold a Grand Prix and it would do a lot for the country in terms of potential growth. To help drum up some local support, the sport's 2 Indian drivers were down to participate, with Narain Karthikeyan getting his seat at HRT back, while Karun Chandhok was given funding by Tony Fernandez personally so that he'd be able to race at his home Grand Prix. But certain things behind the scenes meant that Karun was not able to race, but he still took part in free practice, a session that had to be red flagged for 5 minutes when a stray dog ran out onto the circuit. Good boy. The usual problems with a brand new track began to show themselves, particularly grip. Turns 6 and 7 were the trouble spots, with Petrov, Kobayashi, Buemi and Sutil all going off at some point. But as time went on, the grip improved, with Hamilton leading the first practice session, Massa the second, and Vettel being the first to break the 125 mark in the third. Vettel then set a 124 in qualifying, with Hamilton 3/10 off in his McLaren, but had to take a 3-place grid drop for not slowing down for yellow flags, so it was a Red Bull 1-2. Glock, meanwhile, in his Virgin, needed permission to start the race because gearbox trouble in the first session meant that he was 2 seconds outside the 107% time. In the race, Vettel won by about 8 seconds from Jenson Button, and then Fernando Alonso was in third. But the problems with the infrastructure weren't the only problems that the teams were having to deal with. In the month or so leading up to the race, Nico Rosberg at Mercedes and claims of up to half the HRT team were without visas, having them rejected before they could fly out. There was the very real possibility that there would be a good chunk of the people involved in Formula 1 not able to enter the country, and it could mean that teams would not be able to make the race through no fault of their own. Heikki Kovalainen was vocal about the problems, calling them a joke and overly complex for no apparent reason. But despite the issues, everybody who was supposed to be there was there. The other issue was taxes. Because of the way Formula 1 operates with the handing out of prize money and bits and pieces like that, which happens at the end of the season, unless teams collect prize money after races, but then again, that whole process is complex and opaque. Basically, the Indian government's own laws allowed them to tax Formula 1 for this because the teams were earning their prize money payouts through competing in India. There were rumours that teams could boycott the race, but Martin Whitmarsh, who was the head of the Constructors' Union at the time, denied that would be the case, and the teams would still turn up due to their contracts with Bernie. In the end, the taxes were never paid, as Formula 1 was granted an exception, but this ended up going to India's Supreme Court, due to the circumstances in which Formula 1 had just been allowed by the government to dodge taxes. I say dodge, get an exemption. You know what I mean. In the end, the Supreme Court decided that 25% of all ticket sales would go into a pot while they figured out a resolution. If it turned out that they didn't need to pay the taxes, the money would be refunded. If it turned out they had to pay the taxes, then the money would go to the government. Like the race in Sochi in Russia, there was never a different winner at the Indian Grand Prix. It was always a Red Bull. And while Bottas won the 2017 Russian Grand Prix, Vettel was the only winner of the Indian Grand Prix, if you follow me. In 2012, he led every lap and was denied the fastest lap by Jenson Button. And in 2013, he won his 4th and final world title at the circuit, celebrating by doing donuts on the start-finish straight. And 2013 would be the final Grand Prix in India. Things behind the scenes were starting to take a turn, with Bernie and the race organisers not being able to agree to certain terms. Bernie wanted to move the race to March so that it fit in with the races in China and Bahrain as part of the flyaway early season in Asia, but the circuit wanted to keep it in October, as to them it made no sense in shifting it to March because it would have been so soon after the October race. If you follow me in terms of, well, we're having a race in October and then we're having another one in March, we can't get that organised in time, basically. And the taxation issues weren't helping either. The owners had to write off losses in the region of $25.1 million, and those tax problems I told you about were arising as early as 2009. This was because the Indian government considered Formula 1 to be entertainment rather than sport, and on top of this, the race, much like the Grand Prix at Silverstone, received no government backing, so the circuit had to foot the $40 million hosting fees by itself. And because the state had no ownership of the event, getting tax breaks was going to be tricky, if not impossible. The circuit's promoters in JPSK Sports was denied by the Ministry of Youth Affairs and Sports the ability to remit most of the licensing fees to FOM in London because of that it's entertainment not sport definition. Tax exemptions that applied to other sports were not applied to the Grand Prix, and things like tyres, which were classed as imported goods, were still taxed at the normal level. By the time Liberty Media took over Formula 1 in 2016, the circuit, which had not hosted a Grand Prix since the 2013 season, still owed $50 million in tax. The Indian government said that because the circuit was a permanent facility, FOM, Liberty Media, whatever you want to call them, still had to pay any taxes levied by the government. In the end, they settled for about $14 million. But, like at Korea, there were issues with attendances. Al Jazeera reported in 2014 that while there was the initial novelty of having Formula 1 in the country, as well as an Indian driver and team, by the time the final race in 2013 happened, there was around a 60% drop in ticket sales from the 2011 race. Part of that was due to the tax situation putting people off paying for tickets to an event that might not happen. Vicky Chandhok, who is Karun's dad and the president of the Federation of Motorsports Clubs of India, held meetings with the right people to see if there was any prospect of getting the race back after 2014, with a return preferably in 2015, but it never went through. And 3 years into a 5-year deal, it was gone. But it would be nice to see it back. It would have been mega with the 2017 to 2021 specs of cars, and it might work well with the current V6 land yachts that we have today, given that there's the opportunity in turns 3 and 4 to take different lines. Something that most tracks don't have, and most tracks on the Formula 1 calendar today are very much one groove. But it was a fast, flowing and fun track that the drivers seemed to like, and with India experiencing another boom currently, it might happen. But it seems that Formula 1 is more focused on the US and Middle Eastern markets now. There's also been discussions of developing the circuit into a sports complex, with talks of a 100,000-seater cricket stadium being built somewhere near the track. Because that's one thing you need to know about cricket. In England, it's considered a very boring sport and train spotters just having a couple of days off. But in India, it's a religion. They love it over there. But really, it'll boil down to whether or not the central government can see any potential in it. Will they want to give it the funding that it needs? Or will it just be subjected to the same tax barriers that it had been through before? As I've said in other videos, only time and money will tell. But it's one of the long-lost tracks that still has an element of, oh yeah, that was fun, wasn't it, about it. But what do you think? Let me know down in the comments. So then, a look at the Indian Grand Prix and how, like the Korean Grand Prix, it all fell apart. If this has been interesting for you and you've learned something here today, then do like the video so I know a good job was done. And if you want to see more of my moon-sized head and hear more of my dulcet tones, then hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. And also get that bell on so you never miss out on anything else I do around here. Massive thanks as ever to the oh so kind people at Patreon who support me at a more personal level. And if you want to help pay the bills around here, a link to Patreon is in the description, along with links to Discord, socials and other bits and bobs you might want or need to know. Or there's super thanks if you want to buy me a coffee, and thank you so much to the people who have bought me my caffeine fix lately, it's greatly appreciated. And there's also memberships if you want to do Patreon, but the site weirds you out. So until next time, I've been AdmiralLaWind, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.